The Fairy Godmother's Contract. Why Cinderella's rescue was actually a transaction. The Fairy Godmother appears when Cinderella is at her absolute lowest point, sobbing in the garden after her dress has been destroyed and her last hope shattered. She says something strange. Everything is going to be magnificent. Not, "I'm here to help you," or "Don't cry." She declares the outcome before Cinderella even knows what's happening. Then she imposes one non-negotiable condition: be home by midnight or lose everything. Why midnight? Why such a specific, inflexible deadline for what's supposed to be a gift? Here's what nobody asks. What did the fairy godmother actually want? Because in every transaction, both parties get something. Cinderella gets a night at the ball. What does the fairy godmother get? And why does her magic come with a timer that seems designed not to help Cinderella escape her situation, but to ensure she returns to it? By the end of this analysis, you'll understand why the fairy godmother isn't a benevolent rescuer, but a supernatural agent with her own agenda. Why the glass slippers are the most sinister objects in the entire story, and why Cinderella's happy ending might actually be the beginning of something far more disturbing. This isn't a story about magic saving an innocent girl. It's a story about cosmic intervention in human affairs and the terrible price that comes with accepting help from forces you don't understand. Let's establish what actually happens. Cinderella has been enslaved in her own home by Lady Tremaine following her father's death. When the royal ball is announced, Cinderella attempts to attend using her legal right. Every maiden is invited. Her stepfamily sabotages this by destroying her dress and leaving her behind. Alone and devastated in the garden, Cinderella encounters a glowing woman who identifies herself as her fairy godmother. This raises the first critical question. Where has this fairy godmother been? Cinderella has apparently suffered for years, long enough that everyone calls her Cinderella instead of Ella, long enough that her servitude is completely normalized. The fairy godmother had to have known about this suffering. She's Cinderella's fairy godmother, presumably assigned to watch over her specifically. Yet she only intervenes at this precise moment, when Cinderella has been pushed to absolute despair. The fairy godmother's magic is impressive. She transforms a pumpkin into a carriage, mice into horses, rags into a ball gown, and creates glass slippers. But she imposes that crucial limitation. Everything reverts at midnight. Cinderella accepts these terms without negotiation, attends the ball, captivates the prince, and flees at midnight, accidentally leaving behind a glass slipper. The prince uses this slipper to search the kingdom, eventually finding Cinderella and marrying her. The story presents this as straightforward rescue through magic. But examine the mechanics more carefully, and you'll notice something deeply unsettling. Every element of the fairy godmother's intervention seems designed not to save Cinderella, but to create a very specific outcome. And that outcome requires Cinderella to leave behind evidence. Let's analyze what the fairy godmother actually does, because the specific choices reveal intent. She doesn't give Cinderella money to escape. She doesn't give her information about reclaiming her inheritance. She doesn't make her permanently beautiful or permanently wealthy. She gives her one night, exactly one night, of transformation. Why? Because one night is enough to meet the prince, but not enough to build a real relationship. One night is enough to create attraction, but not understanding. One night is enough to make the prince obsessed, but not enough to make him truly know her. The fairy godmother isn't helping Cinderella escape her situation through her own agency. She's arranging a marriage to a stranger through manufactured attraction. Look at the midnight deadline. The fairy godmother says, the magic only lasts until midnight, and when the clock strikes 12, everything will turn back. This is presented as a limitation of magic, but that doesn't make sense. If she has the power to transform matter, to turn a pumpkin into a functioning carriage with moving parts, to turn mice into living horses with different biology, then she has godlike reality-altering abilities. Why would such power have an arbitrary time limit, unless the time limit isn't a limitation? Think about what the deadline accomplishes. It ensures Cinderella must leave the ball before the prince learns her identity. It creates mystery. It manufactures scarcity and urgency. The prince doesn't just meet a nice girl at a party, he meets a mysterious woman who vanishes at midnight like a dream. That's not rescue. That's marketing. Now consider the glass slippers specifically. Everything else transforms back. The carriage, the horses, the dress, but not the slippers. One slipper is left behind at the palace, and Cinderella keeps the other in her pocket even after the magic fades. The fairy godmother explicitly says everything will turn back. But she's lying. The slippers remain. Why? Because the slippers are the mechanism of the transaction. They're not shoes, they're tracking devices. They're proof of identity that can't be faked or duplicated. Glass slippers that fit only one person in the entire kingdom? That's not fashion, that's biometric identification. The fairy godmother didn't accidentally create unforgeable evidence. She deliberately ensured that the prince would be able to find Cinderella no matter what, even if Cinderella herself didn't want to be found. Watch Cinderella's behavior after the ball. She doesn't seek out the prince. She doesn't send him a message or try to contact the palace. She returns to servitude and accepts it. When the Duke arrives with the slipper, Cinderella is locked in the attic. She's not waiting by the door hoping to be discovered. She's imprisoned and seemingly resigned to remaining that way. The mice have to steal the key to free her. Without them, she would have stayed locked up, and the Duke would have left. This reveals something crucial. Cinderella isn't actively pursuing this marriage. She's not using the fairy godmother's intervention as a tool for escape. She attended a ball, had a nice evening, and went home. She kept the slipper as a memento, not as evidence. The person who wants this marriage to happen isn't Cinderella. It's the fairy godmother. And the fairy godmother made absolutely certain it would happen by creating a tracking device that can't be removed or destroyed. Think about those glass slippers from a practical standpoint. Glass doesn't flex. It doesn't stretch. If the slipper fits, it fits perfectly because it was molded exactly to Cinderella's foot at the moment of creation. But here's the disturbing implication. That means the fairy godmother knew, when she created those slippers, that one would be left behind. She knew Cinderella would lose it fleeing the palace. She designed an object that would be lost, that would serve as evidence, that would trigger a kingdom-wide search. The midnight deadline wasn't about protecting Cinderella from embarrassment if caught in rags. It was about forcing her to flee, to run so fast she'd lose something, to leave behind the proof the prince would need to find her. Now we need to examine what the fairy godmother is and what she wants, because fairy godmother isn't just a job title. It's a species designation. Fairies in folklore aren't benevolent helpers. They're supernatural entities with their own rules, their own logic, and their own agendas that rarely align with human well-being. They make deals. They extract prices. They intervene in mortal affairs for reasons mortals don't understand and wouldn't approve of if they did. The fairy godmother appears specifically when Cinderella says, "It's no use at all. I have nothing left." That's not coincidental timing. That's the precise moment when someone is most vulnerable to accepting supernatural intervention. When you have nothing left, when you've given up hope, that's when you won't read the fine print or question the terms or think about long-term consequences. And what are the terms? The fairy godmother never explicitly states them, which is itself telling. She doesn't say, "I'll help you if you do X." She just acts, imposes conditions, and expects compliance. Cinderella never agrees to the midnight deadline. She's informed of it. She never negotiates for permanent transformation or asks for alternatives. She accepts what's given. This isn't a collaboration. It's a unilateral intervention by a more powerful entity who expects obedience. But there must be a purpose to this intervention beyond Cinderella's individual happiness. Supernatural entities in folklore don't help people out of pure altruism. They have reasons. maintaining cosmic balance, fulfilling ancient obligations, serving larger forces, or extracting something valuable from the human they're helping. So, what does the fairy godmother extract from Cinderella? Consider what happens after the marriage. Cinderella becomes queen. She is elevated from complete powerlessness to absolute power virtually overnight. She goes from being the most vulnerable person in her household to being the most powerful person in the kingdom. And her first act with that power? Forgiveness. She graciously chose to forgive her stepfamily. This is presented as virtue, but think about it from the fairy godmother's perspective. She's just installed someone with unlimited royal authority who has been conditioned to be kind, forgiving, and non-retaliatory even toward people who tortured her. Cinderella isn't going to use her power to punish the wicked or restructure society or demand justice. She's going to be gentle, gracious, and unthreatening. She's the perfect puppet queen. All the authority, none of the willingness to use it. The fairy godmother didn't save Cinderella from abuse. She transformed an abuse victim into a queen while ensuring that abuse victim retained all the psychological conditioning that makes her controllable. Cinderella has power now, but she's been taught her entire life not to assert it, not to demand accountability, not to prioritize her own needs. The fairy godmother engineered a situation where immense power is held by someone who will never use it in ways that disrupt the existing order. Now think about the broader implications. If there's one fairy godmother, there are others. If they intervene in human affairs to arrange marriages and install rulers, then they're engaging in systematic manipulation of mortal kingdoms. They're selecting which bloodlines continue, which dynasties rise, which children get rescued, and which remain in suffering. They're playing chess with human lives across generations. Why would they do this? Perhaps they feed on specific emotions: hope, gratitude, love. Perhaps they're maintaining balance between light and dark forces by ensuring certain people end up in certain positions. Perhaps they're following rules imposed by even higher powers. Or perhaps they're simply alien intelligences who interact with humanity the way humans interact with ant colonies, rearranging things according to incomprehensible logic, occasionally helping individual ants, but always serving larger purposes the ants can't perceive. They're symbols of ownership. Cinderella wears objects created by supernatural power, molded specifically to her body, that can't be removed or replaced. She's marked now. She belongs to the fairy godmother's agenda, whatever that agenda is. And by marrying the prince, she's bringing that supernatural influence directly into the royal family. The fairy godmother now has access to the throne. Here's what the story doesn't tell you: what Cinderella gave up. She accepted magical intervention without understanding the price. And in fairy tales, there's always a price. Sometimes it's obvious: your voice, your firstborn, your soul. Sometimes it's subtle: you owe a favor to be called in later. You're bound by unspoken obligations. You've entered into a contract you don't fully understand. Cinderella never asked what the fairy godmother wanted in return. She never questioned why this help came with such specific conditions. She never wondered why she deserved this intervention when millions of other suffering people don't get fairy godmothers appearing in their gardens. She was desperate, and she accepted. And now she's queen, wearing glass slippers that won't come off, married to a man she spent 4 hours with, holding power she's been conditioned never to use. Think about Cinderella's future. She's in a marriage arranged by supernatural forces, not by her own choice. The prince fell in love with an illusion, a magically beautiful woman at a ball, not the girl covered in cinders doing housework. Does he even know what she looked like before the transformation? Does he know about the years of abuse? Does he know she's only here because a supernatural entity engineered their meeting? And what happens when the fairy godmother comes back? Because entities like that always come back. They don't invest this much effort arranging outcomes without expecting something later. Maybe she'll ask Cinderella to make a specific political decision. Maybe she'll ask Cinderella to give her firstborn the same help she received, perpetuating the cycle. Maybe she'll simply observe, satisfied that she's placed her chosen pawn in position, waiting for the right moment to use that access. Cinderella is trapped now in a different way than she was before. She was trapped by poverty and abuse. Now she's trapped by obligation, by supernatural debt, by the expectations of a role she never chose. She has to be the perfect queen, the gracious forgiver, the kind ruler. She has to live up to the fairy tale the kingdom believes about her. She can never reveal doubt, never question her situation, never admit she might have preferred to escape on her own terms rather than being sold to a prince by a glowing woman with unknowable motives. The real horror isn't the abuse Cinderella suffered from Lady Tremaine. It's the rescue that came afterward. Because abuse, at least, is comprehensible. You understand the power dynamic, you know why it's happening, you know who your enemy is. But supernatural intervention? That operates on rules you don't understand, serves purposes you can't perceive, and binds you to obligations you never agreed to. Lady Tremaine wanted free labor and elimination of competition. The fairy godmother wants something far more complex and far more permanent.